Real famine is coming, and it's all by design. And welcome to this special report. I'm Mike Adams. I've been warning about this for many years. I've covered the long timetable of human depopulation agendas being run by governments and pushed by NGOs and globalists like Bill Gates, etc., and how it weaves its way through various programs, including vaccines, pesticides, herbicides, global warming, climate change, COVID, and now the war in the Middle East. It's important to note that about 1/3 of all fertilizers sail through the Strait of Hormuz normally. And I didn't even realize it was that high. I thought it was only maybe 25%. But the seaborne fertilizer trade for our planet, about 1/3 of that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, there are land routes that are different, but they're nowhere near as large. So this is a significant portion of the world's fertilizer. And of course, that's been shut off now for almost 8 weeks. This is a crisis. Even if you can manage the lack of oil and natural gas and helium and sulfuric acid and all these other things, fertilizer is a critical issue, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is staying in place. And it's a pretty good bet that the Strait of Hormuz is going to stay closed for months. For months. It's not going to open back up next week, no matter what Trump says or tweets or what the White House says. It looks like they're going to keep this shut down for many months, and the food crisis is going to get far worse. Now, China, of course, knows what's coming. China is always challenged to feed its roughly 1.3 plus billion people. So last month, in March, they suspended the export of their nitrogen potassium blends of fertilizer plus phosphate fertilizers, almost all NPK blends, etc. So that's done. And a lot of countries that used to import from China are having to find other sources or pay a lot more or go without. At the same time, Russia, which also normally exports a large amount of fertilizer such as ammonium nitrate, that's been halted. And maybe it's going to resume, maybe not. But globally, the spot price for urea has doubled since February to about $900 per metric ton. And that could go, again, much higher. The longer the strait stays closed, the worse this gets. So I asked AI agents to do some research for me. I said, I want you to find which countries are at the highest risk from these famine-related events. So I want to know which countries are heavily dependent on fertilizer imports through the Strait of Hormuz, through Persian Gulf imports. I want to know also which countries have a very high share of household income that they spend on food, thus meaning they have very little buffer to be able to pay more. I also want to know which countries have a pre-existing food insecurity issue or any kind of an active conflict that could add chaos to this formula. And then which countries have weak fiscal capacity to be able to absorb anything like subsidy costs for food, and also destabilize governments that would make this whole situation worse. So those are my criteria. And then I unleashed some AI agents to go do the research, and here's what it found. First, it reminded me that there are fertilizer plants in countries like India and Pakistan and Egypt that produce fertilizer domestically, but they depend on natural gas as the feedstock, which of course makes sense. We're talking about the Haber-Bosch process, right? Urea or ammonia first. And that natural gas, of course, comes from Qatar, mostly from Qatar Energy, which has already declared force majeure. So there you go. No more feedstock of natural gas means no more fertilizer. And that also impacts Bangladesh and Egypt. Did I say Egypt? Yeah, okay. So many of the fertilizer plants in Bangladesh have already closed down. And Egypt used to get gas from Israel, but that's no longer functioning for political reasons. So Egypt is buying natural gas on spot market. You can imagine what's happening to those prices. Now, phosphate fertilizer production, in case you've maybe never knew the chemistry here, and it's a good reminder for all of us, depends on sulfur. You got to have sulfur, and you have to have sulfuric acid in order to produce phosphate fertilizer. Well, about half of the sulfur comes out of the Strait of Hormuz in terms of seaborne trade. So without sulfur, again, you have to have that as an input. So even if you have a fertilizer plant somewhere, if you don't have sulfur, you can't make phosphate fertilizer. So there's a cascade of domino effect, force majeure, invocations. This is affecting the entire supply chain. And it's worsened by the fact that China and Russia are restricting their exports to countries that most desperately need it. Basically, right now, China is saying, well, it's every man for himself. India even went to China or asked China for some help. Like, hey, we need some of the fertilizer exports. And China said no, probably because India typically sides with the West, instead of doing business with China. So China told India to go pound sand, and India has to feed also 1.3 billion people, or what is it, 1.4 billion people almost by now? Who can keep track? So we're in a crisis that's just beginning. The food stocks that were grown in the last growing season are pretty much, at the end of their pipeline, let's say. I mean, maybe a couple more months, we're sort of eating last year's food, etc., at least here in the northern hemisphere. And then in the southern hemisphere, you're going to see big problems forming up, after the summer, after our summer in the north, let's say August timeframe. That's when it's going to start hitting the southern hemisphere for their planting season. Now, farming depends a lot on credit, of course. And farmers, especially in places like India or Egypt, they're not the wealthy people in society, and it's very difficult for them to get credit to purchase fertilizer. And so there's not really a lot of funding available for buying fertilizer at double or triple the price, which means that a lot of crops are going to be planted without fertilizer, or in some cases, they won't be planted at all. And without these fertilizers, crop yields will, of course, drastically fall, depending on the crop. Corn is impacted probably more than anything else, but rice is also heavily impacted, etc. Legumes, not so much, depends on the crop. But corn, forget it. You don't fertilize corn, you just don't get much corn at all. So even if you plant, and all your fuel inputs are still the same, and all your equipment costs are the same, and all your labor costs are the same, you just don't get the yields that you used to get. And this will contribute to global famine. So let's talk about the FAO says that if you have a 10% reduction in fertilizer, then your rice, corn, and wheat yields plummet by 25% or up to 25%. Citing the fact that, quote, nutrient response curves are nonlinear, which, you know what that means. Again, you cut fertilizer by 50%, your crop yields can plummet a lot more than 50%. That's what that means. It's nonlinear. So you need every drop of fertilizer that you can get, or every granule, and that's just not available now. So yes, famine is coming. So I'm going to go through the countries now that are about to be impacted the most. And most of them have something in common. They're countries populated by black people. And the history of depopulation agendas carried out by Western nations has repeatedly targeted Africa. For example, there were depopulation chemicals put into vaccines that were given in Kenya. That blew up as a giant conspiracy that turned out to be true. Efforts to focus abortion centers in black neighborhoods in America, for example. There are many examples. Too many to go into, but what the Western world or Western globalists, what they have often wanted to do is really suppress populations of black people, both in the United States and also in Africa. And this engineered famine is going to hit African nations harder than anything we've ever seen. And literally, easily, hundreds of millions could die in Africa if the situation continues to worsen. So the number one country that's going to be impacted by this in the world is Sudan. Sudan is a country of over 50 million people. So it's it's about half the size of Iran in terms of population, or a little more than half. It's already classified by the IPC as a Phase 5 famine condition country. 22 million people need food assistance just to keep them alive in Sudan right now. That's almost half the population. Their planting season is June and July, and the harvest is October, November. Do you think they're going to get fertilizer by June? Probably not. No. Half of their fertilizer comes from the Persian Gulf. So they grow a lot of sorghum and wheat. The famine risk of Sudan is very real because the country is essentially already in a state of famine, just barely being staved off by emergency food rescue supplies every year, recent years anyway, for almost half the population. So we're talking about a mass die-off in Sudan from late 2026 through 2027. Mass starvation. You're going to see the photos. You're going to see the calls for help. You're going to see the appeal to, wealthy nations, send food. It's going to get bad. That's already baked in. I don't think there's any way to stop that from happening, unfortunately. The next country that's subject to a similar situation is Yemen. That's right, Yemen, where the Houthis are. In Yemen, and I don't have the population numbers for Yemen, but I know that 18 million people are already in phase 3 of famine because of their economic situation, which is not good. Almost all of the food and fertilizer consumed in Yemen is imported. And, of course, the Red Sea routes are critical to that. But the Houthis there are, engaged in operations to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb. Is that the right name for that strait right there at the opening of the Red Sea? We all got to get more familiar with the vocabulary here. That could mean that the ships, even if there is fertilizer available, that the ships can't necessarily make it through that strait, because of the ongoing war. And remember, the Houthis are disrupting ships that are tied to Western nations like the United States and UK and Israel because of Israel's genocide against Gaza and the Palestinians. So the Houthi action has been going on for a long time, years now, and it's not even related to the war in the Persian Gulf. Although it might become related to that. They might work in unison with Iran. At least that's what's being reported. So Yemen itself is going to face mass starvation if this situation continues. The next country facing famine is Somalia. According to the research, about 6.5 million Somalis are already in phase 3 of famine or higher. There was a bad drought in 2025 that continues to reverberate through their food supply scarcity. They import nearly all of the fertilizer that they use, and commodity prices are already rising in Somalia. So we're going to start seeing famine in Somalia later this year, probably beginning in September timeframe, and then also extending into 2027 as well. So not good, right? So those are the worst countries, Sudan, Yemen, Somalia. Those are the 3 worst in terms of projected famine. Now, in addition to those 3, There are high vulnerability countries like Ethiopia that gets over 90% of its fertilizer from the Persian Gulf. Its planting season is June and July. They're facing massive fertilizer shortfalls. The effects on the diet there, the starvation, will begin to be felt from October onward, and then peaking all the way through spring and summer of 2027. Bangladesh imports about 1/3 of its fertilizers and most of its urea from Saudi Arabia. Domestic production, remember, it has its own fertilizer facilities, but they require natural gas. So even when its own fertilizer plants are running, it only covers less than 1/3 of domestic demand. So without the gas and without the fertilizer imports, Bangladesh is going to face acute exposure to crop failure during the Boro rice season, which is normally transplanted, I'm reading here, December through February, and it's harvested April and May. So that is the country's largest crop by far, which means that if there's not ample fertilizer by the time the end of this year rolls around, then Bangladesh will face extreme famine all of 2027, or beginning in, let's say, roughly the summer of 2027, if they have food supplies to make it that far. Importantly, in Bangladesh, the spending on food is a very high percentage of household spending. It's about 40 to 50% of household spending for the bottom income earners, like the lower 20%. So this could easily trigger unrest in countries like Bangladesh. Another country that's going to be strongly impacted is Sri Lanka. Now, by the way, let me remind you that everybody in the world understands that this is Trump's fault. They're going to point the finger right at Trump because Trump started the war by choice. He didn't have to. Iran didn't attack the USA. This was a war of choice. This was a war because, well, Trump wanted to do the bidding of Israel. So Trump started the war. And it's Trump's actions that are thrusting all of these countries into famine, which isn't being felt yet. But boy, what's coming is going to be absolutely tragic. Now, Sri Lanka in particular, you may recall back in 2021, the government banned the importation of synthetic fertilizers, and it caused a total crop collapse and an economic crisis, and the people burned government buildings, and then the president was removed from office. So that was a bad experiment. Like, what happens if we don't use fertilizer? Everything burns down, it turns out. So people are not going to treat the government nicely in Sri Lanka if they can't get fertilizer. Now, they eat a lot of rice in Sri Lanka, of course, and they're currently harvesting some rice, and hopefully that will go well. But it's going to run out, of course, if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. Now then, there's Pakistan. And in Pakistan, about 7.5 million people are already in food crisis. Some of that's due to a monsoon flooding event of 2025, and then there's persistent drought and so on. So, like many of these countries I've mentioned, Pakistan does have a fertilizer production plant, but it needs natural gas in order for that plant to function. And of course, nobody's getting natural gas now, or I should say the supplies are extremely scarce at the moment and very expensive. Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat. Did you know that? Yeah, 10 million tons annually. Wow. And the government of Egypt runs a bread program that feeds about 70 million people. You know, like a food stamp type of program. So the government buys a massive amount of wheat, and it makes the bread and hands out the bread. Egypt has its own fertilizer industry, but it needs gas in order to do it. And of course, the LNG prices are skyrocketing. Right now, the wheat harvest is in progress in Egypt. So it will be okay for the summer of this year and into the fall. But if you get into the late year And then into next year, if Egypt doesn't have access to gas and fertilizer imports, you could see civil unrest. In fact, this has been part of the history of Egypt, is when bread prices went insane, the Egyptians took to the streets. They started marching on the government. So that could happen as well. You might end up with price controls, probably, because that's what Egyptian governments do. And you're going to have price controls, which is going to lead to black markets and all kinds of bad ideas, bad economics combined with real famine. So Egypt is going to be impacted in a bad way. Nigeria has the largest population of near starvation people in the world. It's 27 million people that are categorized as IPC phase 3 or higher. And it's a category of, food insecurity. So 27 million people, that's a lot of people who don't have enough to eat. So Nigeria has its own fertilizer production, but of course it's subject to natural gas imports, either pipelines or by ship. If Nigeria faces real food scarcity and higher food prices, it's one of those countries with a lot of potential political instability that could, and this could just be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, or the trigger for real social unrest. There's a similar situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DR Congo, which I'm also remembering that Congo is where I think a large part of the world's cobalt comes from, that's used in lithium-ion battery chemistry for EVs and such. Plus, there's also a fair amount of cacao that comes out of DR Congo. Yeah, that's true. But 26.7 million people are in food crisis there in Nigeria, which is massive. The planting season runs September through November, which means that the real famine will probably hit DR Congo in 2027. All right, so those countries, those were kind of the second tier countries that are going to face very serious situations, including potential famine. Now there's a third tier that have better stockpiles, better buffers, more stable, but they will still be impacted. And I'll go through those quickly. That includes India, Turkey, Brazil, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. So, food inflation is going to happen there. There's going to be a lot of unhappy people, but they're probably not going to have mass die-offs. Whereas some of the earlier countries that I mentioned could see real starvation, like Sudan and Yemen and Somalia, etc., Ethiopia. It's going to get bad. So you're going to start seeing, food aid concerts in America in 2027. They're going to pretend like they're raising money to send to Africa, but they never do. They actually just squirrel it away and stuff the pockets of the concert organizers who lie to everybody and take the money and run. There's a prediction for you. It's going to be 100% accurate. You can count on that. Now, David Dubine has, who I've interviewed numerous times, has good information in this area. Michael Yon talks about the engineered famine. But David Dubine has a lot of experience in Southeast Asia, and I think he knows the growing seasons better and the predominant local crops and so on. So I will reach out to David and Michael and people like Matt Bracken and others, and we'll keep you informed as this is happening. But here's the situation. If the Strait of Hormuz were to reopen right now, then probably we would avoid the worst impacts of everything I've laid out for you here. We might not see millions of people starve if the strait reopens right now. But that seems incredibly unlikely for the simple reason that the U.S. and Iran have contradictory goals. Iran, existentially, needs to assert control over the Strait of Hormuz for its own political protection and also monetary recuperation from war damage. Whereas the United States cannot, or at least Trump's ego cannot allow Iran to assert control over this waterway which would allow Iran to charge tolls. And Trump just he can't stand to see somebody else making money if he doesn't get a piece of it, it seems. So it seems very unlikely, at least at the moment, that there's going to be any kind of a peace deal. There may be peace deals announced, especially by Trump or the White House, which has repeatedly, I think Trump has claimed 35 times that Iran has been completely defeated and completely destroyed. He's been wrong all 35 times. So if he announces number 36, don't believe it. He's just saying those things to manipulate the markets, obviously. And the U.S. Navy is nowhere near the Strait of Hormuz. They don't dare approach. So the Navy doesn't control the strait. Iran controls the strait. It's obvious every single day. If normal traffic doesn't return to the Strait of Hormuz, which would be something like 120 to 130 ships a day passing through the strait, if that doesn't return to normal within the next few months, let's say 3 or 4 months, or maybe even less than that, then we get into guaranteed famine in late 2026 and throughout 2027, as I've laid out here. Guaranteed. And even in countries like the United States and Canada, where probably you're not going to see millions of people starving, but you're going to see many millions, tens of millions of people struggling with food costs, or food insecurity, as it's often called by the NGOs. They won't be able to afford to eat, at least not like they used to. Maybe they'll have to buy like a bag of potatoes, Might not be a bad idea for some Americans to learn how to cook instead of buying everything from Uber Eats. Buy some rice and potatoes and a chicken. Make yourself your own soup or figure it out. You don't have to buy everything that's just prepackaged, pre-made, fast food. When I grew up, we didn't buy processed food all day long. We made our own food. We made our own chili. We made our own soup. We made our own whatever, So maybe more Americans are going to have to figure that out. More Americans are maybe going to grow some food and maybe have some backyard chickens, which I have. I get fresh eggs every day. It's awesome. And, some days you have to look for, where did they lay the eggs today? I found a new spot recently in one of the hay bales. And it was like, there's like a dozen eggs in this one spot, because obviously the hen had been laying there for a while. So anyway, it's like Easter every day. You get to find the eggs. Things are going to change for a lot of Americans, and it's going to be, politically very damaging to the GOP and to Trump himself, obviously, if the closure of the Strait of Hormuz continues for a few more months. It'll be devastating for the midterms. Not only will fuel prices go much higher, but also, of course, food prices as well. So that's the reality of the situation. Bottom line, American people probably not going to starve to death, not in very high numbers, maybe not at all. But it's going to suck. You're going to pay a lot more for food. You're not going to be able to afford the food that you used to buy, or many Americans won't. But for countries in Africa, Sudan, and even we talked about Egypt, and even India, even Bangladesh, right? These countries are going to be hit hard. And there you will see mass famine and starvation throughout 2027 if the situation doesn't get resolved. So some people think that's the plan. And maybe I think that too. I don't know. I mean, clearly there's a global human extermination plan underway. Is this war part of that plan? Yeah, very, very likely. Or maybe human extermination is one of the globalists' perceived, quote, benefits of the war. It's like, we get the war and we get to, exterminate 1 billion people or whatever. Like, in their minds, because they're so evil and anti-human, that would be a bonus. So maybe that's what's happening. In any case, you need to be prepared. And so get your own food supplies. You can get them from us, of course, healthrangerstore.com. Lab-tested, certified organic, long-term storable foods, tested for glyphosate, heavy metals, atrazine, all kinds of stuff. We test for dioxins now, too. Did you know that? So check it out, healthrangerstore.com. And then in order to get ready for the economic collapse scenarios, make sure you've got backup communications. I want to give credit to our sponsor, the Satellite Phone Store, SAT123.com. And they've got satellite phones and solar generators and solar panels and Faraday bags and a whole lot more. So check them out, and they can help you get prepared for the difficult times that are coming. But hey, at least the good news is the difficulty that we will experience in North America is nothing compared to the difficulty of being in some of these countries I just mentioned. It's going to get crazy. It's going to get dangerous in a lot of these other countries. And I don't know. I sure do hope that we can find peace and that the Strait of Hormuz opens again. I hope Trump can just swallow his pride and back off, walk away. Let Iran charge tolls. It's worth it. It's worth it. Why not have them collect $1 million per ship for every tanker that rolls through there? The ship's carrying billions of dollars of economic productivity potential. So, who cares if they have to pay $1 million? Iran is right there. I mean, they're on the whole north shore of the strait. You're not going to be able to control the strait unless you somehow destroy the entire Persian civilization, which has not happened in 5,000 plus years of history, and all the attempts throughout history that were tried and failed. Come on, you're not going to be able to destroy Persia, especially since the U.S. military has practically run out of ammo or is close to it. So, find some agreement, shake hands, sign a deal, get us out of there, bring our soldiers home, and let people grow food, okay? That's the answer for humanity. Every day that this strait stays closed, because Trump wants it closed, is a day that projected into the near future, potentially maybe hundreds of thousands of people will die. Every day, the clock is ticking. And human populations are at stake. So join me in praying for peace, and thank you for listening today. I'm Mike Adams. You can follow my work at brightvideos.com and my articles at naturalnews.com. And you can follow my social media posts at brighteon.social. So thank you for listening. Take care. We now have vitamin D3 plus K2 plus Aquaman, which is a seaweed calcium, available at healthrangerstore.com. Here, I've got it up on my site here. This is the Groovy Bee brand that we have, which is our in-house brand, healthrangerstore.com. Again, vitamin D3 plus K2 with Aquaman. That's the brand of the seaweed calcium in a capsule format. Of course, it's laboratory tested for heavy metals and glyphosate and microbiology and so much more. And it's certified ingredients, of course. And, everything that we build for you in terms of a product is meticulously sourced. And one of the most difficult products to source is actually vitamin D3. It's extremely difficult because it turns out in the supply chain, almost all vitamin D has a bunch of sort of unnamed ingredients in it. And that's what our sourcing people found after a couple of years of trying to source a clean version of vitamin D3 that we finally found and nailed and put it in the formula and did all the lab testing and certification. So now it's available. So this synergistic combination, if you think about natural bone support, for example, or you think about the fact that so many people may not have sufficient levels of vitamin D for just optimal health and immune support and many other reasons to have vitamin D levels, this product can help you supplement that. And so it's available now, healthrangerstore.com, vitamin D3 plus K2 with Aquaman, 60 capsules available, shipping right now while supplies last. And in this environment where global supply chains are getting wrecked, if this is something you want, get it now while we have supplies, because it's becoming more difficult and more expensive to source literally everything at this point. So anyway, thank you for your support. You can also find many other products, of course, hundreds of different products at healthrangerstore.com, including storable food. And right here we have our organic powdered chicken bone broth in a number 10 can, our turmeric root powder, and so much more. We've got so many amazing products for you to choose from, including tinctures, superfoods, storable foods, as well as freeze-dried fruits and vegetables in sealed number 10 cans. That's great for long-term storage. Plus we have iodine, and that's a product that's moving very quickly because of concerns about, global nuclear war, unfortunately. But you can find all of this. It's all laboratory tested. It's all certified. It's all meticulously sourced at healthrangerstore.com. And yeah, there we go. That's what the vitamin D3 looks like there. Thank you for supporting us, because we need your support in order to fund our platform. And so we can keep bringing you amazing interviews and content and free AI tools for knowledge and so much more. So thank you for supporting us. I'm Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, for healthrangerstore.com.